him to touch his entire life. Behind it was a hidden entrance. What he found inside made him call the police. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which country you're watching from. Richard Marquez stood alone on the cracked pavement, staring up at the house that had once been the center of his childhood world. The afternoon sun filtered through the thinning branches of an ancient oak, its leaves casting trembling shadows across the sagging porch and weathered siding. The house seemed smaller than he remembered, like a once proud guardian worn down by years of quiet battles and neglect. The yard was overgrown, weeds bursting through the gravel walkway, brush climbing over the remnants of a rusted chain-link fence. A lopsided mailbox still bore his grandmother's last name, Clark, faded and peeling, the letters barely legible. It felt strange to see it without her presence behind the door, her voice waiting to greet him. Instead, there was silence so deep it pressed against his ears. His grandmother had passed only 3 weeks earlier, and the funeral still haunted him. He had arrived late to the service, caught in his job, his life, and the overwhelming guilt of distance he had kept for the last 10 years. She had been the only family he had left after the death of his parents when he was still a young boy. She raised him sternly, but with a fierce love that was often hard to decipher. She wasn't the kind of grandmother who baked cookies or laughed easily. She was watchful, wary, always paying attention to the shadows others pretended not to see. And she had rules that sometimes made sense and sometimes felt like walls built to keep the world away. Above all, she had rules for her home, especially the rule about her bedroom. He could remember every warning word as if she were standing beside him now, her voice taut and unyielding. "Don't go into my room unless I tell you. Don't touch the mirror on that wall. Ever." Back then, he had obeyed willingly, too frightened by the intensity in her eyes to disobey. Now, he was the only living heir, with full ownership of a house filled with unanswered questions. He took a slow breath and stepped onto the porch. The boards groaned beneath his weight, complaining as though they resented being disturbed after settling into stillness. He pushed open the front door, and a wave of stale air greeted him. Dust, aged wood, cleaning chemicals, and something subtly floral that reminded him of his grandmother's perfume. It was as if time had stopped functioning the day she left the world. His eyes adjusted slowly as he entered the living room. The curtains were still drawn, filtering the sunlight into muted gold that touched the furniture like gentle fingers. The decor was frozen in a different era. A crocheted blanket draped over the couch, a television perched on an old rolling stand, framed photographs arranged neatly above the fireplace mantel. He paused before those photos. There was one of him at 8 years old holding a soccer ball, another of his parents smiling in front of a picnic blanket, the summer before the accident that ended everything. He touched the edge of the frame, guiding away a layer of dust. A deep ache squeezed inside him. He wondered if his grandmother had looked at these photos often in her final years, longing for the laughter that once filled these walls. He continued through the house, his footsteps stirring tiny clouds of dust that sparkled in the muted light. The kitchen was just as he remembered. Brown cabinets with loose handles, a refrigerator covered in magnets from grocery stores long closed, a worn linoleum floor with cracks like lightning strikes. He brushed his hand over the countertop where she used to prepare collard greens and cornbread. She would hum softly while cooking, but always stopped when she noticed him listening, as if music was her one vulnerability she couldn't allow anyone to see. As he walked down the narrow hallway, he glanced into what had been his childhood room. The door creaked as he pushed it open. Everything was intact, eerily preserved. His old books stacked on a shelf, posters of basketball legends curling at the edges, his small bed still made with a navy blanket. A small part of him felt comfort in this frozen familiarity, yet another part felt exposed, as though he had stumbled into a memory that wasn't meant to be revisited. It hurt to think she had kept this shrine of his youth intact for so long, even after he stopped coming around. But it wasn't this room that pulled at him. It was the one at the end of the hall, the one that had always been off limits. Her bedroom door stood slightly ajar, the first sign of casualness he had ever seen in relation to that sacred place. He hesitated before touching it, old habits of obedience flooding back with surprising force. He pushed gently, and the door opened into a room cloaked in stillness. A large bed dominated the space, its quilt tucked neatly as if awaiting someone who would never return. On the nightstand sat familiar objects: her Bible, a pair of reading glasses folded carefully, a bottle of pills sealed and untouched. The curtains here had been drawn too, leaving the space dim and cool. But his attention was pulled instantly to the far wall. The mirror, it was even larger than he remembered, tall and rectangular, framed with dark wood carved into intricate patterns. It looked ancient, like something rescued from a mansion or a forgotten church. The glass was so clean it reflected every detail with hard clarity, making the room seem both more spacious and more confining. He stepped closer and noticed thick bolts securing the frame directly into the wall. Strange. Who bolts a mirror like this into place? And why so firmly? A shiver crawled up his spine before he could rationalize it. He remembered the way she would look at the mirror, how her eyes would flick toward it as if checking something, and always with caution. He forced himself to look away and turned his attention to the rest of the house. The place needed work. Electrical issues, plumbing repairs, fresh paint everywhere. Selling it as it was would barely bring in enough to cover his grandmother's debts, much less give him a chance at a clean start. He had loans to pay, a job that never paid enough, and a desperate need to move forward in his life. Fixing the house was the only option. He told himself that was the mature, responsible decision. But now that he stood here, surrounded by memories stronger than he'd expected, doubt began to creep in. Was he really ready to tear apart the last physical connection he had to the only person who had remained after his world shattered? The only person who, even through silence and strictness, had loved him fiercely? He rubbed his forehead, feeling an unexpected sting behind his eyes. He didn't want to mourn anymore. Mourning was exhausting, and he had lived too long with grief as his shadow. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a reminder from work about upcoming deadlines, the very pressures that had kept him away from her as she grew older. He silenced the notification and tucked the phone away, forcing himself to breathe evenly. No more looking back. The house was his now, and it was time to make practical decisions. The doorbell suddenly rang, jolting him. Startled, he walked to the front door and peered out. A woman from across the street waved nervously, clutching a grocery bag. Her gray hair was cropped close, and she wore a pastel sweater too thin for the season. He opened the door slightly, keeping his voice polite. She gave him a soft, unsettled smile and introduced herself as Mrs. Grant, a neighbor who had known his grandmother for decades. She didn't step closer, as if invisible boundaries kept her rooted to the sidewalk. Her eyes darted to the house's windows before settling awkwardly on him. She offered condolences, but her voice wavered as she spoke, like grief wasn't the only emotion weighing on her. Then she asked quietly if he planned to stay long. The question wasn't casual. It sounded like worry disguised as curiosity. When he told her he would be here for a while, working on the place, she nodded slowly, lips tightening. "Just be careful in there," she said, her gaze drifting toward the upper windows again. Before he could ask what she meant, she turned quickly and shuffled away, almost trembling. Richard stood frozen, watching her until she disappeared into her house. The unease in her voice, the way she refused to come near the porch, all of it settled inside him like a cold stone. He wasn't someone who bought into superstition or nonsense. He believed in what was real, what could be explained. But the longer he stood there in the doorway, the more the silence around the house seemed to pulse. He stepped back inside and closed the door carefully. The lock clicked too loudly. He returned to the hallway and looked again toward his grandmother's bedroom, feeling an inexplicable tension building inside him. That mirror, those bolts, that rule she clung to so intensely. What had she been trying to protect? Or what had she been trying to contain? He lingered there, caught between logic and the growing pull of curiosity. He thought of the mountain bills and the opportunity this house represented. He needed to get to work. Needed to start tearing down old walls, replacing broken things, making room for a future. The mirror was just a mirror. The house was just a house. The past was dead. Yet, as he stepped into the bedroom once more, all he could think about was how alive her warning still felt. He exhaled slowly, the room's stillness pressing against him like a held breath. Whatever secrets lived here, whatever his grandmother feared enough to bolt a mirror into the wall, he would eventually have to face. The plan was set. The repairs would begin in this room. Whether he liked it or not, the first step toward his future lay behind that mirror. And somewhere, deep inside, he felt the first stirring of dread that once he uncovered the truth, there would be no turning back. He left the bedroom light on as he backed out and gently closed the door. The thin crack of light beneath the door looked like a watchful eye trailing him down the hallway. He didn't dare look back again until he reached the living room where he sat heavily on the couch, exhaustion crashing over him like a wave. The old house creaked and sighed, settling into the night. Richard told himself he was only imagining the sensation that the house was waiting for him, watching him, deciding when it would let him in on its secrets. He leaned his head back, closed his eyes, and listened to the heartbeat, slow pulse of silence that filled his grandmother's forgotten home, unaware just how deep and dark the truth beneath that mirror would go. The darkness gathered quietly, patiently, as though the house itself understood that something long hidden had finally returned, and soon it would demand to be found. The night in his grandmother's house stretched endlessly, wrapped in the kind of silence that made ordinary sounds feel intrusive. Richard slept fitfully on the couch, turning from one side to the other as memories stirred through his dreams. At one point, he woke abruptly, certain that he had heard footsteps in the hallway, the kind of deliberate pacing that suggested someone was searching for something. But when he sat up and listened, the house was still. Just old wood shifting with the temperature, he told himself. Just nerves reminding him that he didn't belong here anymore. Eventually, exhaustion dragged him back under, though the uneasy air never quite lifted. Morning arrived with a thin wash of sunlight slipping between the curtains. Richard pushed himself upright, his back stiff from the couch, his thoughts already heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. The house felt colder than it should have, as if the absence of its owner had seeped into the walls. He rubbed the sleep from his eyes and tried to shake off the lingering discomfort. Today was the day he would begin the renovations in earnest. Today, he would start with the hardest place, her bedroom. He forced down a quick breakfast, standing by the kitchen counter while the kettle hissed and sighed. The radio on his phone played lightly, but even music couldn't dispel the house's brooding quiet. Every now and then, he caught himself glancing toward the hallway, like something unseen was calling him back to the room with the mirror. Finally, with a steadying breath, he gathered his tools and headed there, determined not to let childish memories slow him down. The bedroom awaited him in the muted morning light. Dust motes drifted lazily in the sunbeams that escaped between the curtains. For a moment, he simply stood in the doorway, struck by how little the room had changed. It felt like stepping into a meticulously preserved memory, everything arranged just as she had kept it, as though she might walk back in at any moment and straighten the coverlet or adjust the lamp. The thought made his chest tighten unexpectedly. He had spent so many years keeping distance, only to find her presence everywhere now that she was gone. But he reminded himself why he was here. The house needed renewal if it was ever going to be worth anything. He set his toolbox down beside the bed, and his gaze was drawn like gravity to the mirror bolted to the wall. Its surface reflected his form sharply. The room doubled in eerie, near-perfect clarity. Even in the light of day, the mirror gave off an unsettling aura. Not because he expected something supernatural, he wasn't a child anymore, but because his grandmother had guarded it from him so fiercely. There had been no explanation, only fear and urgency in her voice whenever he dared get too close. He approached it now, each step a mild rebellion against years of discipline. He reached out and laid his fingers across the carved wooden frame. The wood was cold under his skin, its dark grooves filled with age. He braced himself and tried to tug the mirror away from the wall, but it didn't budge. The bolts securing it looked newer than the mirror itself. Thick steel glinted beneath the grain of the wood, biting deep into the plaster. It wasn't just mounted. It was locked in place, intentionally. The realization sent a prickle of unease down his spine. He stepped back and studied the frame more carefully. He crouched, inspecting the bottom edge. Layers of plaster and paint met the frame seamlessly. Too seamlessly. Someone had patched and repainted around this object multiple times. This mirror hadn't been moved in decades, maybe not since before he was born. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory, "Don't touch that mirror." It wasn't a simple warning. He knew that now. It had been a barrier. A guard posted over a secret. Chewing the inside of his cheek, he considered leaving it alone. He could simply paint around it, work around what he didn't understand. But practicality pushed back. If there was damage behind it, mold, a cracked support beam, old wiring, he'd have a bigger problem later. A mirror could not be allowed to dictate the fate of renovation plans or the value of this house. Even if it had meant something to her, she was gone, and he had to live with the consequences of whatever lingered here. He steadied his hands and set to work. The first bolt required effort, the screwdriver scraping as he forced it to turn through years of rust and stubborn resistance. When it finally loosened, a metallic groan reverberated through the room, making the air feel heavier. He paused, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to appear and scold him. But the room remained still, the house observing this forbidden act in silence. He moved on to the next bolt. This one gave way a little easier, though the sound it made was no less jarring. With every bolt removed, the mirror became less stable. He slid furniture into place beneath it to catch its weight and avoid shattering the glass. He couldn't explain the nervous sweat gathering on his palms, but he kept going, his heartbeat thudding loud in his chest. The final bolt clinked to the floor and the mirror, now freed, leaned ominously forward. He took hold of the frame and slowly tilted it outward. A puff of dust spilled into the air, catching the light like drifting embers. The weight nearly overpowered him, and for a moment he feared it would crash forward and shatter into 1,000 punishments for disobedience. But he managed to guide it safely onto the cushioning furniture, his breath ragged with the effort. He stepped back and stared, the mirror now removed, and the truth behind it exposed. The wall did not look like the rest of the room. It was a slightly different shade, smoother, as if finished with greater care. More importantly, it bore a rectangular outline, faint but unmistakable, a hidden door. His pulse quickened. He reached out and traced the uneven edges, feeling where the plaster met the frame of something concealed. At the bottom, a small seam separated slightly from the rest of the wall, like a secret trying to reveal itself. He swallowed hard. Curiosity pulled at him relentlessly, even as anxiety pressed down with equal force. He searched the edges until he found it, a latch buried under a thin layer of paint. He scraped the brittle coating away until the metal revealed itself. It looked almost new under the old paint, as if someone had maintained it regularly. Someone who wanted this hidden space secure but accessible. His fingers tightened around the latch. He paused, looking around the bedroom one more time. Nothing stirred. The sunlight held steady. The air was still. Only his own pulse beat like a warning. But he had come this far. There was no turning back now. He pulled. The latch clicked sharply, and the panel popped forward. Cold, rushing air greeted him, carrying a scent of earth and forgotten things. The narrow entrance yawned open, revealing a vertical steel ladder trailing downward into darkness. He grabbed his flashlight from the toolbox, flicked it on, and aimed the beam inside. The light barely penetrated the gloom. The ladder looked old but sturdy, disappearing into a shaft that seemed to drop much deeper than the house should allow. He hesitated at the threshold. His grandmother had kept this hidden for a reason, and she had done everything she could to ensure he never discovered it. The weight of that truth pressed against his chest, tightening his breath. But standing at the edge of a mystery that had shaped his entire life, he couldn't simply walk away. He placed one foot onto the first rung. The metal groaned under his weight, reverberating up the walls like a whispered dare. He took a breath and descended into the unknown. As he went deeper, the daylight above faded into nothingness, replaced only by the weak glow of his flashlight. The walls around him were concrete, etched with time and streaked with moisture. The air felt cooler, denser, tinged with the metallic scent of old machinery. Each rung of the ladder creaked but held firm, urging him downward until his feet finally met solid ground. He turned slowly, raising the light to reveal the space before him. It opened into a wide, bunker-like room, its ceiling low and reinforced with steel beams. Rows of dusty shelves lined the walls, filled with boxes and case files. Old equipment sat on tables, radios with cracked dials, stacks of VHS tapes, black and white monitors that looked like relics from another age. There were notebooks, too, their pages yellowed, corners curled. Charts and city maps were pinned haphazardly, covered in markings and dates, like the obsessive research of someone who feared forgetting even the smallest detail. Richard stepped forward cautiously, his shoes stirring a veil of dust from the floor. He swept the beam of his flashlight across the room and caught sight of photographs pinned in clusters on the wall to his left. He approached them slowly. Dozens of faces stared back at him. Men, women, teenagers, children, some smiling, some caught mid-expression. Beneath several of them were handwritten notes. Missing, case closed with a question mark, identified but never found. His heart hammered. He recognized a few, faces he had seen on old flyers when he was young, faces of people whose disappearances had been whispered about in the neighborhood with fear and resignation. People no one ever saw again. And then his breath caught in his throat. At the center of one cluster hung a photograph he knew all too well. His parents, captured in a candid moment shortly before they died. His mother's warm smile and his father's easy stance brought a sudden burn of tears. Beneath their photo, his grandmother had scrawled notes, details he had never known existed, police reports, witness accounts, conflicting statements, words circled angrily, not accidental. The room spun for a moment as he tried to ground himself. His grandmother had built this underground watchtower of truth. She hadn't simply been strict or paranoid. She had been preparing, documenting, protecting him, because she knew something real, something dangerous. The flashlight trembled in his grasp as the enormity settled in. This secret wasn't just about a mirror or a room. It was about lives stolen, stories buried, families torn apart. It was about the lie he had believed for years about his parents' death. His grandmother's warnings weren't madness, they were fear. Fear of what might come for him if he uncovered what she had spent decades fighting alone. Richard stepped back, his breath shallow, his thoughts racing. He stared into the dark corners of the room, imagining her coming down here quietly at night, writing in those notebooks with trembling determination, knowing she couldn't stop the past, but maybe, just maybe, she could save the future. He looked back up toward the ladder, a sliver of daylight peeking down the shaft. It felt impossibly far away. He realized the world he thought he knew had cracked open, revealing a truth far more complicated, painful, and dangerous than he ever imagined. He wasn't sure yet what to do or who to trust, but he knew one thing now with absolute certainty. His grandmother had not simply left him a house, she had left him a mission, and as long as he stayed here, he would be crossing a line from which there was no turning back. Richard lingered at the foot of the ladder, staring into the vast, dim chamber that lay hidden beneath the house he once believed he knew so well. The air felt heavier here, dense with the presence of secrets long buried and fiercely guarded. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the low hum of his flashlight and the faint, distant echo of the house settling above him. He stood motionless for a long moment, trying to convince himself that this wasn't some fever dream or delusion born from grief and exhaustion. But the cold concrete under his shoes, the stale scent of old paper and rusting equipment, every sense assured him that this place was real. Here was something his grandmother had devoted her life to, something powerful enough to make her hide a full bunker beneath her own home and bolt it away behind a mirror. His heartbeat pounded hard in his chest as he forced air into his lungs and stepped deeper into the room. Shadows shifted along the walls as his light moved, revealing details that grew more disturbing with each discovery. Tables were cluttered with film reels and cassette players, their cords coiled like snakes. Stacks of documents sat arranged in boxes by dates, covering decades of time. Old tape recorders and dusty microphones sat on shelves, accompanied by labels marking years and locations. And everywhere he looked, he found maps of the neighborhood and surrounding city plastered against the walls, littered with red circles, arrows, scribbled notes, and markers that formed a chaotic spiderweb of connections. This room wasn't random storage. It was meticulously curated, an archive of something that mattered deeply to the person who had built it. He moved closer to one of the maps, squinting at the dates. They ranged across years of his childhood, with some even predating his birth. His grandmother had quietly documented the lives, and likely deaths, of others while raising him under the same roof. His heart tightened with a sudden surge of emotion. What had she seen? What had she known? And why, after all those years, had she still chosen silence? His flashlight passed again over the wall of photographs and lingered unwillingly. The collage felt alive, like dozens of watchful eyes followed his movements. He stepped forward, feeling the weight of those gazes more and more acutely. He reached up and touched the edge of a photograph of a teenage girl, smiling brightly in a school portrait. Under her name, the word "missin'" was scrawled. Then his hand drifted to the next and the next, each picture accompanied by terse, chilling notes. Never found, last seen, presumed runaway. When he found the cluster featuring his parents, he froze, unable to move or even breathe at first. His father looked strong, confident, full of potential in his pressed shirt and easy smile. His mother glowed with joy, her eyes sparkling with the promise of a life that would unfold in happiness. Richard traced the date written at the bottom of the picture only days before the accident that stole them from him. The sight of it splintered his composure. He swallowed hard, blinking back tears that threatened to spill. His childhood had been anchored by the belief that life was cruel but random, that a tragic twist of fate had taken everything from him. That belief had shaped him, hardened him, haunted him. Yet here, before him, evidence suggested it was not fate at all. It was a choice made by someone who believed they could destroy a family and disappear into safety. Someone who believed they could silence witnesses forever. The walls seemed to close in around him. His flashlight trembled. He leaned against the table nearest to him, his thoughts spiraling into a storm of grief and rage. How long had his grandmother lived with this burden, unable to speak it aloud? How much fear had she swallowed down while raising the last surviving member of their family? He noticed a familiar object on the edge of the table. His grandmother's distinctive handwriting on a worn notebook. Carefully, he picked it up and flipped through the pages, discovering entries detailing suspicious activities in the neighborhood. She had cataloged strange cars that parked under the cover of night, men lurking near playgrounds and storefronts, families who vanished without a trace. Every entry was organized and dated, sometimes accompanied by photos or receipts stapled to the pages. His grandmother hadn't been paranoid. She had been vigilant. As he read further, he found a section devoted entirely to his parents. There were snippets of interviews she had conducted with neighbors, notes from meetings she had arranged in secrecy, and copies of police documents that didn't match the official statements he remembered seeing as he grew old enough to ask. Names of officers and local officials appeared throughout. Some crossed out with red ink as though she'd discovered their involvement and condemned them silently. Others had question marks beside them, maybe because she wasn't entirely sure who among them was guilty and who was merely negligent. He stumbled upon a page with a name he recognized, a powerful politician whose face appeared often on the news, speaking of justice and community reform. She had drawn a thick circle around his photograph with words that twisted Richard's blood to ice. Responsible. Ordered. Forced silence. He stared at the page, his mind reeling with the implications. A man who now sat in government halls dictating the future of the city, maybe even the country, had been linked to horrors buried deep in their community's past. And his grandmother had been tracking him, gathering proof of what he did and preparing something. It suddenly made sense why she had hidden this room. If she had revealed it while still alive, they might have silenced her too. Maybe they had tried. The thought tightened his throat. Had his grandmother spent her final years not in peace, but in fear that her death would be the signal for everything she fought for to be lost forever? That all the evidence she collected, all the sleepless nights spent gathering stories and monitoring suspects would vanish with her? He clenched his fists. He couldn't allow that to happen. He eased the notebook shut and continued scanning the room. At the far end, he found a cluster of electronic devices positioned together, a wall-mounted monitor, several small security cameras, and a set of reels for live recording. Dust blanketed the equipment, but the organization suggested they hadn't been abandoned. Not truly. Tangled cords told the story of a constant rearrangement and upgrading over the years. It wasn't hard to imagine his grandmother down here, sitting in the glow of that screen in the dead of night, watching someone, waiting for the moment when truth would expose itself. Richard shined his light on a stack of cassette tapes labeled by street names he recognized. The homes where he had played as a kid, streets where his school bus had dropped him off, familiar corners where he'd once bought candy from local shop owners. That realization, she had been watching everywhere, not out of distrust but out of protection, brought a fresh wave of emotion to his chest. The love in that devotion was staggering. She hadn't been cold. She had been carrying the weight of an entire community alone. The deeper he ventured into the room, the more he felt like a trespasser in a sacred place. Every box was a graveyard of lost stories. Every scrap of data held a plea from someone who'd vanished, begging not to be forgotten. His grandmother had preserved them all so they wouldn't be erased by time or by those who benefited from silence. Opposite the latter, a thick steel door loomed in the wall. Richard approached it cautiously. It was heavier than the hidden entrance upstairs, reinforced and sealed with manual locks. The knobs and bolts were coated with rust, implying that this part of the bunker hadn't been opened in years. He hesitated, unsure if he wanted to know what lay behind it. Not every truth needed to surface. Not every secret was meant for discovery. But then again, this room existed because his grandmother refused to accept ignorance, because she knew the cost of not knowing. He steadied himself and gripped the wheel-like latch. It refused to move at first, groaning as if objecting to being disturbed. He applied more force, using his full weight, until finally the lock jerked and the mechanism gave way. He pulled the door open just enough to cast his flashlight beam through the gap. Inside was a smaller room, far more clinical than the rest. Metal filing cabinets lined the walls, labeled meticulously with numeric codes and dates. There were locked drawers with warning stickers that spoke of classified information. On a desk near the center sat another set of folders, arranged in a neat pile as if awaiting her return. But the most unsettling discovery was the projector aimed at a roll-down screen, frozen mid-frame, and the image still faintly visible on the screen. It was his parents' house, their old driveway, the side of their home. His home. His breath hitched. He stepped fully inside, drawn to the screen like a moth to flame. He inspected the dusty projector, resisting the urge to wipe away what appeared to be fingerprints still fresh on its surface. He hit play. The machine sputtered to life with a low whir, and the image brightened. He saw figures moving through shadows. A man approached the house, glancing around before lifting an object into the trunk of a car. Another man followed moments later, carrying something wrapped in a sheet. Richard felt his knees weaken. The date stamp in the corner of the screen matched the night of the accident that had claimed his parents. The truth stood before him and roared so loudly inside that he couldn't hear anything else. His parents hadn't died in an accident. They had been murdered. They were silenced for what they knew. And his grandmother had captured the proof. For a moment, he couldn't do anything but stare, the image flickering in front of him like a nightmare trying to escape into the waking world. His vision blurred as he imagined his grandmother alone down here, replaying that night repeatedly to gather every detail she could while raising him upstairs unaware. When he finally forced himself to breathe again, he stepped back into the main room, switching off the projector. He needed fresh air. He needed to think. The ladder loomed ahead, and he made his way toward it, his legs weak and his heart thrashing violently. The climb back to daylight felt longer, as if the shadows below reached for his ankles, unwilling to let him leave. He emerged into the bedroom and pulled the hidden panel shut quickly, the darkness swallowed with one firm push. The mirror still leaned precariously nearby, leaving the raw secret exposed in plain view. Had anyone else known? Had someone been watching for this moment? A sudden chill rushed through him as if the air was warning him. Knowledge came with a price. He pushed the mirror back just enough to cover the panel temporarily, though not fully secured. His mind was too disordered to worry about careful concealment right now. He needed space. He moved out of the room and leaned heavily against the hallway wall, dragging his hands over his face. The house seemed to pulse around him. His grandmother's presence felt tangible now, guiding him, urging him to continue as carefully as she once had. He inhaled slowly, letting the shock settle bit by bit. What he had found was not just a private obsession, it was evidence, a battlefield of history, a lifeline to justice. He made his way to the living room and collapsed into the couch, still clutching the notebook. His thoughts raced too fast to grasp fully, but one thing was clear. This wasn't truly the beginning of his journey. It was the continuation of hers, and just as she had protected him silently for years, he would now carry and protect the truth she had entrusted to him, because whatever waited behind those secrets was still alive. And it would not welcome the light. Richard did not sleep that night. He sat in the living room with the lights off, the notebook open on his lap, and the projector's images replaying relentlessly in his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the shadows of those men, the wrapped shape carried from his childhood home, the silent conspiracy that had stolen his parents away while he slept upstairs unaware. It felt like his memories had been rewritten in real time, truth erasing the comforting lies he had clung to for decades. The house was quiet around him, too quiet. The walls seemed to hold their breath as if waiting for his reaction. He glanced towards the hallway again, the darkness at the end of it deepening, narrowing into a void. Behind that void lay a door, and behind that door lay answers that he could no longer pretend he had not seen. His grandmother had hidden her battle not out of paranoia, but out of fear. Fear of people with enough power to bury families, to silence neighborhoods, to turn tragedies into accepted fictions. She had chosen vigilance over surrender, turning her own home into a fortress of truth. The enormity of her sacrifice pressed upon him until he felt like his chest might crumble under its weight. Morning eventually broke, pale and uncertain. Richard rose stiffly, his muscles aching from tension rather than exertion. A headache throbbed behind his eyes, and his mouth was dry from a night spent clenching his teeth. He poured himself a glass of water in the kitchen and leaned against the counter, staring out the window at the street he once rode his bike down without fear. Now he wondered how many hidden histories were buried beneath those sidewalks, how many lives had been erased quietly while the world carried on above them. A movement outside caught his attention. A car he didn't recognize idled across the street, its windows tinted too dark to see inside. The engine rumbled low, steady, patient. Richard held his breath as he watched it. He tried to tell himself that people parked on the street all the time, but not here, not in a neighborhood that had emptied out over the years, not with the way the car pointed directly at his house, unmoving, like an observer waiting. He didn't dare keep staring. Instead, he stepped away slowly, chest tightening. The water in his glass trembled slightly. His fingers had begun to shake. Paranoia? Or had someone already noticed that he had discovered what was meant to remain hidden? He moved back into the living room and sat for a moment, waiting. The car didn't leave. The engine never revved. Whoever sat inside seemed committed, as if they had all the time in the world. Richard felt the walls of the house closing in again. He grabbed his phone and checked signal strength. 3 bars. Good. If danger came, he would not be alone in it. The thought offered little comfort, but it was something. Eventually, the car pulled away, slowly, almost casually. Yet he felt no relief. It wasn't the kind of departure that brought closure. It was a promise. We know you're there. He rubbed his face and stood. If he was going to make sense of everything, he needed to start where his grandmother had, collecting facts, building a clear picture of the forces she had been up against. He returned to the hidden room and descended once more into its shadows. The ladder creaked beneath him, the air chilling as he went deeper, but his resolve grew more solid with each rung. He wasn't just searching for answers now. He was preparing for a conflict his grandmother had fought alone for far too long. He began carefully reviewing her notes, creating his own understanding of the chain of events. She had documented decades' worth of disappearances and threats. People from their community, good people, vanishing after witnessing crimes or resisting exploitation. Police reports that dismissed victims as criminals or runaways. Coroners who signed off on inconclusive causes of death without question. Officials who reshaped narratives until families accepted heartbreak as inevitability. It hadn't been random. It had been orchestrated. Richard followed the pages that detailed those early years when his grandmother first became suspicious. There had been break-ins, unexplained fires, intimidation tactics, meetings she had attended with other concerned neighbors who wanted to fight back but feared retaliation. Some had tried to speak out and then disappeared. Others were forced into silence. And through it all, his grandmother continued her quiet war, building a network beneath the surface of daily life. Her notes revealed patterns, hidden deals, forged community initiatives masking corruption, money flowing into hands that profited from subjugation. In the middle of it stood the same name written in thick ink, Councilman Tom Avery, now a senator campaigning for national office as a symbol of change and hope. Richard remembered seeing Avery on television, speaking passionately about justice and reform. He remembered believing him. Now, understanding what lay beneath the polished speeches made his stomach churn. Avery had built his empire on suffering, people like his parents who got too close to truths that threatened the powerful, Richard mapped out the timeline and saw another chilling realization forming. His grandmother's investigations intensified the same year his parents died. Their deaths weren't just casualties. They were warnings. And she must have known all along. The sheer courage it had taken for her to continue after losing her own child was staggering. She had lived each day carrying that pain while also raising a grieving boy, pretending to be nothing more than a strict grandmother with old-fashioned rules. All the while, she descended into this bunker night after night, preserving proof that Avery and those who served him hoped would vanish. Richard felt tears again, not from sorrow alone, but from admiration so fierce it burned in his veins. She had fought a war without telling him because she refused to let fear define his future. She wanted him free of this darkness. Yet she left him the truth anyway, knowing that someday he would need it. He wiped his eyes and steadied his breathing. The question now was what to do with everything she had left him. He turned to the desk that held the most recent documents, wanting to know how far she had gotten in her plan. He found transcripts of overheard conversations, printouts of emails, recorded calls. The last entry in the notebook was dated only a week before she died. It mentioned Avery's upcoming speeches and hinted that he had moved to silence the last witnesses who could expose him. She had written one chilling line beneath her notes. "If anything happens to me, it won't be natural." Richard's heart stopped. Could her death have been murder? Had they eliminated her to ensure that her story died with her? He recalled how quickly the funeral arrangements had been pushed through, how the hospital had been reluctant to provide full details, citing privacy and procedure. He had been too overwhelmed to question anything then. Now, every detail felt sinister. His fingers tightened reflexively around the notebook. He closed it and set it down carefully. He needed help, allies, people who would believe him and who had the courage his grandmother had. The police wouldn't be an option. They were part of the machine that erased people like the ones on the wall. He climbed back up the ladder and emerged into the bedroom again. This time he didn't bother hiding the entrance. Let anyone see what he had seen. Let them know that fear no longer lived here alone. He went to his phone and started searching for contacts. Journalists known for exposing corruption, activists who had battled against the same forces his grandmother had. He wasn't sure who would answer or who might dismiss him as delusional, but he had documentation. He had evidence. He had purpose. The phone rang as he waited. His pulse picked up with each ring. Finally, someone answered. A woman introduced herself, her voice calm but alert. Richard explained carefully who he was, what he had found. He didn't expect her to believe him immediately, but she didn't hang up. She listened. And when he paused, she asked thoughtful questions, noting details he hadn't even yet processed. She asked to meet him, to review the documents, to help figure out the next steps. The relief he felt was almost overwhelming, but he kept his voice steady. They arranged a time for the next day. After the call ended, the silence that followed did not feel as suffocating. There was momentum now, a thread connecting his grandmother's hidden war to a future where justice might finally surface. But that sense of hope was fragile. He knew he wasn't safe. He knew others would move quickly if they suspected he was gathering allies. As he paced the living room, a new thought crept in. He wasn't the only one who knew about the hidden bunker now. The men who had sat in that car earlier, they were here because the house was no longer quiet. Because something had shifted. because someone had reported movement where none should have existed. They would return. They would try to take back what his grandmother had built. Richard turned toward the hallway, gaze fixing on the bedroom again. He could feel the weight of the truth beneath his feet. He thought of the trapped souls in those photographs, their pleas for justice contained in dusty files. He would not let their stories be buried again. Even as fear twisted inside him, determination rose stronger. His grandmother had believed in the power of truth. She had fought for it, died for it. And now it was his turn. The house creaked again, as if acknowledging his resolve. He looked around at the dim walls, the worn furniture, the remnants of a life lived with quiet strength. He wasn't alone here. He carried the spirit of the woman who had raised him to be resilient, who had sacrificed everything to protect what mattered most. He straightened his shoulders and exhaled slowly. The time for pretending ignorance had passed. Whatever forces his grandmother had opposed in silence, he would confront with a voice they could no longer ignore. He owed her that. He owed his parents that. Most of all, he owed himself the truth. And he would not stop until he had dragged every last shadow into the light. The atmosphere inside the house shifted after that phone call, as if the very walls sensed that truth was beginning to rise from beneath the floorboards and climb toward daylight. The air felt more alert, charged with a new tension that pressed against Richard's nerves. He moved through the room slowly, checking each window, every door, and listening for sounds that didn't belong. His senses sharpened in a way they never had before. He was no longer simply a visitor in his grandmother's home. He was a guardian of her secrets and of his own fate. Late afternoon shadows stretched long across the floor as he began cleaning the living room, not out of tidiness, but because he needed something to occupy his hands while his mind sifted through his grandmother's meticulous investigations. Every creak of the floor made him look up. Every distant car passing outside drew his attention to the window. He kept expecting the unknown watchers to return, the ones who had parked outside earlier. He tried to convince himself that it was coincidence, paranoia seeded from uncovering too much too fast. But deep inside, he knew the truth. Nothing about his life was coincidence anymore. Eventually, he forced himself to eat something, though his appetite was thin. By the time night fell, exhaustion tugged at his body, but his mind refused to rest. He took a blanket from the closet and settled onto the couch again. He didn't want to sleep in the bedroom, not while the hidden entrance lay exposed beneath the mirror, not while danger lurked unseen beyond the walls. Sleep took him in unsettling fragments. He drifted through shifting memories, his grandmother sitting upright in her rocking chair, her stern eyes darting toward the bedroom and that mirror, his parents laughing in the driveway, before the scene twisted into the silent footage he saw on the projector. Then the faces from the wall in the bunker hovered, staring at him, silently pleading. Every dream left him gasping awake, heart pounding, sweat chilling his skin. Dawn eventually came like a dull blade, offering little comfort. Though sleep had been scarce, he rose before the sun fully warmed the horizon. He brewed strong coffee and took his cup with him to the back porch. The yard was overgrown, the fence barely standing, but the grass glistened with beads of dew that sparkled like tiny promises. The stillness didn't feel peaceful. It felt like a held breath. He checked the street. No car this time. For the moment, he was alone, or so he hoped. He returned inside and began organizing the evidence he intended to show the journalist who had agreed to meet him later that day. But as he worked, A sudden clang upstairs interrupted his concentration. The sound came from the bedroom with the mirror. He froze. The mug nearly slipped from his hand. The house was too thick with silence for that noise to be accidental. Not wasting another second, he grabbed a heavy flashlight from the counter and made his way down the hallway, each step quiet but purposeful. His pulse hammered in his ears. When he reached the bedroom door, he paused, listening. Nothing. As if the moment he arrived, the house once again melted into stillness. He pushed the door open slowly. To his terror, the mirror was no longer leaning where he had left it. It had fallen flat against the floor, lying face up, reflecting the ceiling light in fractured angles. The panel in the wall behind it stood slightly ajar, not wide open, but open enough that he instantly knew one horrifying truth. Someone had been here. His chest tightened. His throat dried. The intrusion wasn't imagined. Someone knew the secrets hidden in the house, and now someone had crossed the line between observation and action. He forced himself forward, his voice shaky as he called out. No response. He knelt and inspected the mirror. The way it lay suggested it had been moved deliberately and then dropped in haste. Footprints smudged against the floor. Dust disturbed too freshly to have been his. He swallowed hard, then turned his light to the panel and the ladder descending into the bunker. He didn't hear movement below, no breathing, no clink of equipment. But that brought no comfort. How long had the intruder been here? What had they taken? Or worse, what had they left behind? He descended the ladder with caution, each rung vibrating beneath him. His flashlight beam drifted across the underground room. Nothing looked overturned. The projector remained off, but a faint disturbance caught his eye. A drawer to one of the filing cabinets now stuck halfway open, a file missing from its row. Panic gripped him. He moved closer, scanning for the label that should have rested there. It was from a box labeled Avery, the most crucial evidence his grandmother had gathered. Gone. His knees nearly buckled. The reality was instant and brutal. The people who had caused this suffering were still powerful, still watching, and now they knew he had something they wanted destroyed. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a coil of wire on the floor. It felt like the room itself was shrinking around him, pressing in with suffocating darkness. His grandmother had been so careful. She had built this fortress through fear and sacrifice, and in a single night he had compromised everything she protected. Climbing out of the bunker, he slammed the panel closed and shoved the mirror back upright, securing it enough to block access temporarily. He rushed to the windows, pulling the curtains open, letting light flood the house like a plea for protection. The daylight didn't erase his fear. It only made the edges of danger easier to see. He spent the following hour calling the journalist, updating her urgently. She sensed the seriousness instantly and offered to come earlier than planned. Richard agreed. The sooner someone else saw this, the less chance there would be for the truth to be erased again. He paced while waiting. Each minute crawled by. Every creak of the house made him jump. His phone vibrated with a text from an unknown number. "Leave the house now." He deleted it without responding, but dread slithered up his spine like ice. Another message followed. "This is your last warning." His hands trembled as he placed the phone down. Now they were being blunt. A slow realization dawned. If the intruders had wanted him dead, he would already be gone. They didn't want his life. They wanted his silence. The knock came so sudden and loud that he flinched. He hurried to the door and peered through the peephole. A woman stood on the porch, clutching a messenger bag, scanning the street nervously. The journalist. He unlocked the door quickly and ushered her inside. She introduced herself and wasted no time asking to see the bunker. He took her directly to the bedroom, explaining everything rapidly. The mirror, the hidden panel, the stolen files. She recorded the entire walkthrough on her phone, documenting his discovery. When they reached the underground room, she took several photos and rifled through his grandmother's notes with practiced precision. "This is extraordinary," she whispered, eyes wide. "Your grandmother was building a case that could destroy careers, maybe even put powerful people in prison." Richard nodded, voice raw. "Someone already knows I have this. They were here last night. They took something." She looked at the disturbed cabinet, and her expression hardened. "That means the evidence here is real and dangerous." Her conviction steadied him. They spent hours scanning documents, making digital copies, building a portable archive that could survive if the physical one was compromised. She made calls, arranging for allies to meet them soon, lawyers, activists, others who could help protect and expose the truth. By late afternoon, preparations were underway. Richard felt lighter in a way, knowing he wasn't alone anymore. But beneath the relief simmered a deeper, sharper awareness. The threat was still present, and now it was accelerating. As the journalist packed her equipment to leave, she assured him that multiple copies of everything would be stored safely by nightfall. Even if the house burned down, the truth would not. That brought him some comfort. But when she drove away and the sun dipped low again, fear crept back through the cracks of the house like a returning storm. The quiet settled heavily, reminding him of the eyes watching from the darkness of the street. He double-checked every lock, stacked furniture against the doors, sat on the couch with a baseball bat within reach. He tried to read his grandmother's notes again, but the words blurred through exhaustion and dread. Night fell fast. Hours passed in tense silence, until a snap echoed from the side of the house. Richard bolted upright. The bat almost slipped from his sweaty grip. His breath hitched as footsteps approached the porch, slow, cautious, too deliberate to be innocent. He reached for his phone, hands shaking. The bat felt absurdly small against an unseen threat. Another footstep, then another. Before he could dial, the footsteps retreated. Silence swallowed the house again. He slumped back, heart racing so violently it hurt. They weren't going to strike tonight. They weren't here for violence, not yet. They were letting him know they could reach him whenever they chose. Fear was their weapon. Silence was their goal. Richard wiped his forehead with his sleeve and tried to steady his breath. The intruders hadn't come to finish anything. They had come to remind him that everything had just begun. His grandmother had lived with this terror for decades. Now it was his turn, and no matter how deeply fear rooted itself into his bones, he knew one thing more clearly than anything else. He would not let them win. Not while he still had breath to fight. The night after the intruders circled the house passed slowly, thick with dread that clung to Richard like a cold shroud. Every hour he jolted awake to some imagined sound. Footsteps on the porch, whispers outside the window, the creak of a floorboard that felt too deliberate to be the settling of an old house. By dawn he had slept no more than a handful of minutes, his nerves stretched taut and humming like wires ready to snap. Yet, underneath the exhaustion, something deeper lived now. Resolve. He understood that fear was precisely the tool his enemies relied upon, the same tool they had used on his grandmother, his parents, and countless others. They controlled communities by making people too afraid to speak, too afraid to resist. If he bowed to fear now, he would be surrendering not only his family's truth, but every life marked on those walls downstairs. Morning arrived gray and muted, clouds thickening overhead, as though even the sky braced itself for what would unfold. Richard brewed coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the remnants of his grandmother's notebook, flipping through its pages as if gathering strength from her handwriting itself. Her notes felt alive, a whisper of her guidance reaching across time. He imagined her seated here decades before, writing by dim lamplight, each stroke of her pen fueled by a will far stronger than fear. It humbled him, inspired him, made him ache. By mid-morning, the journalist returned with 2 colleagues, a lawyer, and an activist who had spent years confronting institutional corruption. They arrived in a small, inconspicuous sedan, scanning the street carefully before stepping out. Their presence filled the house with a new energy, one that made Richard feel less alone. He ushered them inside quickly, locking the door behind them. They exchanged greetings quietly, their voices low and cautious. The lawyer, a man in his late 50s with steady, sharp eyes, introduced himself and immediately asked to see the bunker. The activist, a woman younger than the rest, moved with determination, already setting her recorder and notepad on the table. Together, they descended into the basement room. Richard watched their faces as they surveyed the underground archive, the rows of documents, the meticulously organized evidence spanning decades. They were not shocked by the existence of such a place. Corruption had taught them not to underestimate what ordinary citizens might resort to when institutions abandoned them. But they were astonished by the depth and breadth of the archive. It was not the work of a paranoid recluse. It was the diligent, methodical work of someone who knew she was fighting against a system. This is the kind of material people dream of finding, the journalist said, flipping through a dossier with reverence. Your grandmother was extraordinary. The activist nodded, eyes shimmering with admiration. She documented what everyone else was too afraid to speak about. This isn't just evidence. It's history. It's testimony. Their words brought a tightness to Richard's throat. He felt an overwhelming pride swell inside him, a validation of everything he had suspected about his grandmother but had never dared to believe. For so long he had thought of her silence as emotional distance, unaware it was the armor she wore to protect him. The lawyer began carefully gathering the files they would need most urgently, documents linking Avery to specific acts, testimonies from families whose loved ones had disappeared, details of police involvement, and, the most striking, the visual recordings of the night Richard's parents died. He handled them with precision, scanning everything into multiple secure drives and cloud systems. Redundancy was key. If someone tried to destroy one copy, others would outlive it. As they worked, the journalist asked Richard countless questions, not only about the evidence but about his grandmother, his childhood, the strange moments he remembered but never understood until now. Richard answered everything he could, sometimes halting, sometimes steady, rediscovering parts of his past with new clarity. Every new memory illuminated another facet of his grandmother's quiet resistance. Her late-night outings, her cautious glance out the window whenever a siren wailed, her insistence that Richard never answer the door when she wasn't home, her refusal to let him play in certain parts of the neighborhood. None of it had been arbitrary. She had been shielding him from the same dangers she tracked underground. Hours passed. The work became a coordinated ballet, scanning, copying, cataloging, encrypting. The lawyer murmured occasionally, crunching sequences of numbers or legal references under his breath. The activist transcribed testimonies and cross-checked details, mapping the constellation of crimes that Avery and his associates had scattered across decades. The journalist compiled everything into a timeline narrative, carefully weaving facts into a story that the public could understand and rally behind. At noon, they took a brief break, sitting around the small kitchen table with sandwiches and bottled water. No one spoke much. Each person seemed lost in their thoughts, steeling themselves for the magnitude of what they were about to unleash. There was no illusion that this would be safe. Avery was wealthy, connected, and ruthless. Exposing him meant inviting danger, but none of them wavered. "This is bigger than any of us," the lawyer finally said, breaking the silence. "If we hesitate, the next family will be destroyed. The next witness will disappear." The weight of his words settled heavily but firmly. Richard nodded, a pulse of determination beating in his chest. The group resumed their work. By mid-afternoon, they had assembled the core evidence into a package ready for public release. Written reports, digital archives, witness statements, maps, photographs, and, most critically, the video footage of Richard's parents' final hours. The truth was no longer confined to the bunker. It lived now in encrypted drives, secure servers, and the minds of people who refused to be silenced. As they prepared for the public announcement, the journalist placed a hand on Richard's shoulder. "I know this is painful," she said softly. "I know seeing what happened to your parents must feel like losing them all over again. But this, what you're doing, will mean something. It will shake the foundations of everything Avery built." Richard nodded slowly. "It has to. He can't keep burying people." The time came. They set up cameras and microphones in the living room, careful to angle the footage away from the windows. The activist prepared a statement. The lawyer reviewed statutes and legal precedents to accompany the release. The journalist synchronized files across multiple platforms so that when the story went live, it could not be scrubbed from existence. Then, with a deep breath, they hit publish. The story erupted across the internet like wildfire. Social media feeds exploded with headlines accusing Avery of crimes spanning decades. News outlets rushed to cover the unfolding scandal. People shared the recorded footage, horrified, outraged, demanding answers. Anonymous accounts corroborated the data. Former police officers hinted at cover-ups. Family members of victims came forward, voices trembling but unafraid. The story was far larger than Richard had realized, and once it began to unravel, it refused to stop. Within an hour, Avery's office released a statement denying everything, calling it an organized smear campaign launched by radicals. But the evidence was too comprehensive to dismiss, too detailed, too damning. And with every passing minute, more voices rose in support of the investigation. While the world above boiled with outrage, Richard remained inside the house, anxiety pulsing through him with every new update. The journalist assured him that they had taken all possible precautions, but fear curled in his stomach like a living thing. Exposure meant vulnerability. The darkness that had hunted his family was now cornered, and cornered predators were most dangerous. The sun lowered by late afternoon, smearing the sky with bruised colors. The activist and lawyer packed their things, preparing to leave and meet with others assembling public protests downtown. The journalist lingered a moment, promising to check on him later and urging him to call if anything seemed strange. After they left, the house felt too empty again, as if its walls exhaled all the tension the group had brought into it. Richard stood in the middle of the living room, staring at news updates on his phone. Avery's campaign headquarters had gone silent. Protesters gathered outside City Hall. People demanded a federal investigation. It should have brought him relief. Instead, the unease returned in full force. Night crept in quickly, swallowing the last of the day's light. Richard turned on every lamp in the house, unable to bear the darkness. The shadows pressed in anyway. Outside, the wind stirred, brushing tree branches against the siding in a rhythm that sounded almost intentional. He made himself a cup of tea. His hands trembled around the mug. A sudden alert flashed on his phone, a live broadcast from outside Avery's mansion. Then another from a political commentator. Then a trending hashtag calling for Avery's immediate arrest. The story had broken through every barrier his enemies might have erected. It was now too big to hide, too loud to silence. For a moment, he allowed himself to breathe. Then came the knock at the door. It was soft at first, almost polite. Then it came again, firmer this time. Richard froze. No one should be visiting him now. His allies had gone. Neighbors rarely approached. No one came knocking after dark in this neighborhood anymore. The knock came again. He approached the door slowly, bat in hand, heart hammering against his ribs. He didn't open it. Instead, he pressed his ear to the wood, listening. Silence. Then a low voice murmured through the door, deep and calm. "Richard," it said, "we need to talk." A chill ran through his veins. He knew that voice. He had heard it in recordings, in speeches, in news broadcasts. He had heard it while his blood boiled with rage. Tom Avery stood on the other side of his grandmother's door. The predator had come, not with fear, but with confidence. Richard stepped back, gripping the bat so tightly his knuckles ached. The house held still, waiting. The truth was out. Now the darkness wanted to negotiate, and Richard understood with terrifying clarity that the unmasking had only just begun. Richard stood frozen, staring at the front door where Avery's voice had seeped through like poison. Every instinct screamed at him to stay silent, to not give the man who had been the architect of so much horror even the smallest satisfaction. The house's air felt brittle, like a single wrong breath would shatter the fragile safety left within its walls. He forced his feet to carry him backward, away from the door, each step careful and quiet, as though Avery could see through solid wood. A faint tremor ran through Richard's hand as he tightened his grip on the baseball bat. Even the wood seemed to sense the danger it might soon meet. For a moment, silence lingered again. Then came a sound. Slow, deliberate footsteps descending from the porch. Gravel crunched under polished shoes. The car door clicked softly. The engine started, pulled away, but Richard did not allow relief to seduce him. This wasn't retreat. It was reconnaissance, a final warning. We see you, we know you, and we're coming back. Only when the engine noise faded did Richard allow himself to breathe again. His lungs ached from holding on to panic too long. He sank against the nearest wall, the bat slipping from his fingers, and closed his eyes. Every nightmare he had endured, every suspicion his grandmother had borne alone, had materialized at his door in the flesh. He imagined Avery on the other side, wearing his public mask of charm, but underneath, something sharp, cold, hungry for power, and willing to mutilate truth itself to protect it. Richard pressed his palms to his face and stayed still until he managed to command his body to move again. He retrieved his phone with hands still shaking and texted the journalist. The response came almost immediately. "We're bringing you somewhere safe. Don't open the door for anyone. Lock everything. Stay in the living room. We're on the way." He followed every instruction. Windows, doors, curtains, everything locked and blocked. The house turned into a fortress once again, though nothing felt strong enough to fend off what lurked beyond. He kept his bat close. He waited, heart pounding in uneven rhythms. It didn't take long before headlights swept the street out front, and soft knocks tapped out a pattern she had described beforehand, so he'd recognize it. A password knock, a signal of safety. He opened the door only when she spoke his name. They rushed him into the car, and the vehicle peeled out of the neighborhood swiftly, but not so fast as to draw police attention. In the seat beside him, the lawyer stared intently ahead, scanning for any tailing cars. The activist's gaze searched his face, assessing his state, looking for cracks fear might have carved into him. The journalist reached over and pressed a hand to his shoulder in steadying reassurance. He hadn't left the house for anything other than groceries since arriving. Now, as they drove away, he realized he was finally stepping into the same world his grandmother lived in for years. The world where truth and survival existed in conflict, and every block held predators lurking in official badges and expensive suits. They didn't take him to a police station or a visible activist office. Instead, they brought him to a modest community center that had become a quiet headquarters for the investigation. People bustled through the main room with purpose. Computer screens glowed with open files and maps. Phones rang with urgent messages. Volunteers, lawyers, victims, and allies gathered in whispered clusters. The scandal wasn't just news, it was movement. A momentum too large to be silenced again. One of the victim's daughters, now a grown woman, stepped forward to thank him. Her voice trembled as she spoke of the hope she finally felt after 20 years of unanswered questions. Richard didn't know how to respond. He felt unworthy of gratitude when he himself was still unraveling the truth of his parents' fate like an exposed nerve. But her presence, her gratitude, these things fueled him. For hours they worked beside him, reviewing what had been published, analyzing Avery's denials, preparing for legal escalations and possible arrests. Richard remained quiet, listening, learning, deepening his understanding of the battle he had inherited. His grandmother's evidence wasn't the end of the story. It was the foundation of a reckoning. Night deepened around them before the journalist insisted he get some rest. They had prepared a small private room upstairs in the center for him. Plain walls, single bed, minimal furnishings. It was safer than the house for now. Richard lay down fully clothed, the exhaustion of the previous days claiming him quickly. Sleep took him harder than he expected, but this time it was not full of nightmares, only distant murmurs of voices that felt like fragments of memory, like his grandmother reading quietly in another room, eyes always alert even when she pretended calm. When morning arrived, sunlight poured over the city with an almost defiant brightness. Richard joined the others downstairs, where the lawyer greeted him with solemn news and a spark of hope. Federal investigators had now taken an interest. Several officers had been suspended pending inquiry. One of Avery's known associates had been taken in for questioning. Evidence was spreading faster than Avery could stamp it out. Every hour drew the truth further from the grave that had contained it. But retaliation also intensified. The community center received threats, emails, calls, anonymous messages dripping with menace. Protesters gathered around City Hall demanding Avery's indictment, while groups loyal to the senator angrily countered. The divide widened, tension stretching like a rope about to snap. The journalist took Richard aside and told him with soft urgency that he held more power now than anyone else in the room. He had become the symbol of the story, the man whose family's tragedy connected to everything people were now learning. Whether he had wanted it or not, people were turning to him as the voice of truth his grandmother never could be. Richard didn't feel like a leader. He felt like someone clinging to the edge of a cliff. Yet, when he thought of her, the woman who stayed silent only so he could grow strong, he knew he couldn't retreat now. They asked him to speak at the first major press conference scheduled that afternoon. He stared at them in disbelief at first. He had never spoken to crowds, much less on live television. But the idea of honoring his grandmother's work through silence felt like betrayal. He agreed. He spent the morning crafting his thoughts, reflecting on the lives pinned to the walls of that underground bunker, the laughter of children who no longer existed, the dreams of men and women whose names had been replaced by headlines labeling them missing or troubled. He remembered his parents, his father teaching him how to tie his shoes in the driveway, his mother's soft singing as she tucked him in. Their love, their light, stolen. In the afternoon, he stepped onto a makeshift stage outside the city's municipal building. A sea of faces stared back, some hopeful, some furious, some desperate. Cameras pointed toward him from every angle. Microphones crowded the podium like metal serpents. He swallowed, his palms slick despite the cool air. He began speaking slowly. His voice wavered at first, but steadied as he spoke about his grandmother, about her strength and her devotion to protect people who no one else would protect. He talked about fear, the way it governed a community, suffocating justice. He described the evidence she had preserved in secret, the proof that exposed how power had fed upon the vulnerable. And then he spoke about his parents. His voice cracked when he said their names, Michael and Angela Marquez, their identities restored after decades of being reduced to a tragic headline. He promised that their deaths would no longer be a closed case or a forgotten one. The crowd listened in profound silence. When he finished, they erupted with a roar so fierce it felt like thunder rising off the pavement. Chants filled the air. Justice for the lost. Arrest Avery. No more silence. Richard stepped away from the podium in a daze, heart pounding with adrenaline and grief and something else, vindication. The journalist embraced him. The activist squeezed his shoulders. Even the lawyer allowed a solemn smile. The people had taken the truth into their own hands. That night, the community center remained buzzing with activity. Volunteers worked around the clock to protect the digital evidence, assist families, and communicate with legal authorities. Hope and vigilance lived side by side. Richard slipped away for a moment, stepping outside into the cool air. He looked to the horizon, thinking of the old neighborhood and the house that had held his childhood, sheltered so many secrets. He realized now why his grandmother had always been so guarded. She fought an enemy that wielded both power and shadow. But now the shadows were shrinking, scorched by truth. The next day, when it was finally safe enough, he returned to her home with the journalist and several volunteers. They sealed the bunker entrance with reinforced barriers, ensuring that the archived evidence there remained protected, but no longer hidden so precariously behind a mirror. They photographed everything, boxed items carefully for preservation, and removed what was needed for ongoing investigations. Richard stood in his grandmother's bedroom once more, staring at the wall where the mirror had hung for so long, guarding the truth like a silent sentinel. He ran his hand over the plaster where her secrecy had lived. The mirror stood leaned against a dresser now, waiting. He lifted it, not as a burden, but as a tribute, and rehung it on the wall. This time, not to conceal anything, this time as a reminder, a remembrance. The reflection it cast now included him, not as a frightened child, but as the man she had prepared him to become. Later, in the backyard, the activist and several community members helped lay a memorial plaque under the oak tree his grandmother used to admire every morning. It bore a simple inscription in elegant lettering, in honor of those who were silenced. Your stories rise again. Beneath it, smaller but no less powerful, dedicated to Eleanor Clark, whose courage lit the way. Richard placed fresh lilies beneath the plaque and whispered a promise that trembled through his entire being. "I'm still here, Grandma," he murmured, "and I won't let the truth die. Ever." He stayed there a long time, watching the wind stir the leaves above him. For the first time since he arrived, he felt at peace in this house, not because the danger was gone, but because he knew he wasn't facing it alone. The voices of those lost would no longer be ignored. Their justice had begun. When he stood again, he felt the presence of his grandmother nearby, not as a ghost of fear, but a memory of strength, guiding him into a world she had fought so hard to change. This house was no longer a hiding place. It was a beacon, and Richard would carry its light forward into every darkness that remained. If this story kept you on the edge, don't forget to hit subscribe right now. New shocking true stories are coming soon, and you do not want to miss what happens next. Share this video with someone who loves mysteries as much as you do.